The rain in Sonoma County that November came down soft and steady, the kind that locals called vine rain, gentle enough not to bruise the last of the late harvest grapes still hanging heavy on the trellises. Inside a narrow, dimly lit bar on 3rd Street called the Barrel Room, 26-year-old Claire Whitfield sat alone at the counter, swirling the last inch of a glass of Zinfandel, trying to forget the email she'd received that afternoon, informing her that the small vineyard her grandfather had left her was 3 months behind on its water rights lease. Claire wasn't the type to drown her problems in wine, not usually. She'd grown up 2 hours north in a modest farmhouse outside Healdsburg, the daughter of a school teacher and a man who spent 30 years pruning vines with his own hands before arthritis took his grip. She'd inherited the land, 12 acres of aging Zinfandel and Petite Syrah vines, when her grandfather passed the previous spring, and she had spent every month since discovering just how brutal small-scale winemaking could be for someone without capital, without connections, without the kind of quiet institutional money that kept larger estates afloat during a bad year. She didn't notice the man who sat down 2 stools away until he ordered a glass of the same Zinfandel she was drinking, then asked the bartender, unprompted, whether it had been through malolactic fermentation. Claire glanced over despite herself. The question wasn't the kind of thing you asked unless you actually knew wine, not the kind of casual trivia people picked up from a weekend tasting tour. Malolactic fermentation, the secondary process where sharp malic acid, the same acid found in green apples, is converted by specific bacteria into softer lactic acid, the same compound found in milk, wasn't bar conversation. It was cellar conversation. "It has," she said before she could stop herself. "You can taste it in the finish. Less bite, more roundness." The man turned toward her. He was maybe 30, 32 at most, with sandy blonde hair a little too neatly combed for a rainy Tuesday night, sharp blue eyes, and the kind of build that suggested physical work rather than a gym membership, broad through the shoulders, forearms visible below rolled sleeves, a faint scar along one knuckle that looked old, healed, deliberate, rather than accidental. "Nathan," he said, extending a hand. Nathan Wren. Claire. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Nathan, it turned out, claimed to work in agricultural logistics, moving grape shipments and bulk wine between smaller producers and larger distribution networks up and down the West Coast, a job vague enough in description that Claire didn't think twice about it, since half the people in wine country described their jobs in similarly foggy terms. He asked good questions, real questions, about phylloxera-resistant rootstock, about the specific way Sonoma's maritime fog moderated daytime heat during ripening, about the biological mechanism by which tannins in grape skins bind to proteins in the human mouth, which is what actually creates that dry, puckering sensation people call tannic, rather than any change in the amount of saliva itself. By the time the bartender called last round, Claire had laughed more than she had in months, had forgotten, briefly and completely, about the water rights lease sitting unopened in her email inbox. When Nathan walked her to the door, the rain had softened to a mist, streetlights haloed in gold, and before either of them fully decided to do it, she kissed him. It was, she would later say, the last uncomplicated moment of her life for a long, long time. What Claire didn't know, what Nathan Wren had deliberately not told her over 2 hours of easy conversation about fermentation science and rootstock genetics, was that his real surname wasn't Wren. It was Caruso. And the agricultural logistics company he worked for wasn't a company at all in any sense that would show up on a tax filing. It was the operational front for a distribution network that moved considerably more than grapes through Northern California's wine corridor, using legitimate wineries, small struggling ones especially, as laundering points for cash that needed a plausible paper trail before it could re-enter the legitimate economy. Nathan had grown up outside Chicago, the youngest son of a mid-level capo in a Midwestern crime family that had, over the previous decade, expanded its interests westward as federal pressure on East Coast operations intensified. His father, Vincent Caruso, had sent him to California 3 years earlier, not to make wine, but to identify small, financially vulnerable vineyards, places drowning in debt, places one bad harvest away from bankruptcy, places whose owners might be persuaded, quietly and with generous terms, to let outside investors handle their books. Claire Whitfield's 12 acres, struggling under a water rights dispute and a mounting lease payment, had been on Nathan's list for exactly 11 days before he walked into the barrel room. He hadn't planned to talk to her that long. He certainly hadn't planned to feel anything when she kissed him on the sidewalk outside, rain misting down around them like something out of a memory neither of them had made yet. But he had, and it complicated things in a way that men in his line of work were trained, explicitly and repeatedly, never to allow. 3 days later, Claire was in her grandfather's old barn, technically her barn now, checking on the ancient basket press that hadn't been used commercially in almost a decade, when a black SUV pulled into the gravel drive. She assumed, at first, it was someone from the county about the water rights. It was not. Nathan stepped out, alone, dressed differently than he had been at the bar, a dark wool coat instead of a casual sweater, and something in his posture that made Claire's stomach tighten before he'd said a single word. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He told her, standing in the mist between the barn and the vine rows, close to everything, that the man she'd met at the barrel room wasn't entirely a lie, but wasn't entirely true either. He told her his real name. He told her, in careful, deliberate language that avoided specifics that could be used against him later, that the organization he worked for had identified her vineyard as a potential acquisition target, that men considerably less interested in her well-being than he was would likely come calling within the month with an offer that would look, on paper, like generous debt relief and would, in practice, cost her the land outright within 2 years. Claire stood very still, the basket pressed cold and heavy beside her, and asked the only question that mattered. "Why are you telling me this?" Nathan's jaw tightened. Because I've spent 3 years doing exactly what I was sent here to do, without once asking myself what happens to the people on the other side of the paperwork. And then I met you, and I actually thought about it for the first time. Claire didn't trust him immediately. Anyone with sense wouldn't have. But over the following 2 weeks, as autumn deepened and the last of the vineyard's leaves turned a deep russet gold, a color caused, she'd learned from her grandfather decades earlier, by the breakdown of chlorophyll revealing the anthocyanin pigments that had been present in the leaves all along, simply masked by green, Nathan kept showing up, not with flowers, not with grand gestures, with information. He explained, in the flat, careful tone of a man laying out facts he wished weren't true, how the acquisition scheme worked. A struggling vineyard owner would be approached by a legitimate-seeming investment firm, offering to buy out their debt in exchange for a minority equity stake. Paperwork thick enough that most owners, desperate and financially inexperienced, wouldn't read closely enough to notice the clause converting that minority stake to majority control the moment a single loan payment was missed. Within 18 months, the original owner would typically be bought out entirely, for pennies against the land's real value, while the vineyard itself became a fully laundering-capable operation, moving cash through wine sales that no auditor would think twice about, since fluctuating harvest yields and unpredictable wine pricing made financial irregularities almost impossible to distinguish from ordinary bad luck. "It's the harvest that makes it work," Nathan told her one evening, standing among her vines as the fog rolled in low and thick off the coastal hills. Nobody questions a winery's income being unpredictable. 1 year phylloxera or frost takes half your yield. The next, you get a bumper crop. Cash businesses with legitimate volatility are the easiest thing in the world to hide money inside. Claire, who had spent her childhood summers learning from her grandfather exactly how vulnerable a vineyard actually was, how a single hard frost at the wrong moment in spring could destroy a season's buds before they'd even opened, how phylloxera, the same microscopic aphid-like insect that had nearly destroyed European viticulture in the 19th century, by feeding on vine roots until the plant starved, still lurked in untreated soil, and was the entire reason nearly all modern vines were grafted onto resistant American rootstock rather than grown on their own roots. Understood immediately how perfectly her own industry's fragility made it a target. "So what do I do?" she asked. "I can't just refuse to sell. If your father's people threaten to make my life difficult, they don't need me to say yes. They just need me to run out of options." Nathan looked at her for a long moment. "Then we make sure you don't run out of options." What Nathan proposed, over the following 10 days, was not a dramatic confrontation, not a warehouse standoff, not the kind of thing either of them had seen in movies about men like his father. It was something quieter, and in its own way, more dangerous, because it required Nathan to work directly against the organization that had raised him. He explained that his father's operation, like most laundering schemes built on agricultural fronts, depended entirely on discretion. The entire system worked because nobody looked too closely at a small winery's books, because the volatility of harvest yields provided perfect cover, because vineyard owners desperate enough to accept generous debt relief were by definition unlikely to have the resources to fight back with lawyers or forensic accountants of their own. Claire, however, had something Nathan's father hadn't accounted for: a small but genuine circle of connections built up by her grandfather over 40 years in the local wine industry. Relationships with the Regional Farm Bureau, with a county agricultural extension officer who had spent his entire career studying exactly the kind of ownership transfer fraud that had been quietly spreading through smaller vineyards for the better part of a decade. And, crucially, with a young attorney in Santa Rosa who specialized in agricultural land disputes and had, for 2 years, been building a file on a pattern of suspicious vineyard acquisitions across 3 counties without ever having enough concrete evidence to act. Nathan couldn't hand over documents directly, not without exposing himself in ways that would put both of them at serious risk. But he could do something almost as effective. He could ensure that when his father's associates approached Claire with their offer, every clause in the contract, every buried conversion trigger, every piece of language designed to obscure the true terms was flagged in advance, translated into plain language Claire's attorney could use to build a public case the moment the offer was formally made. The moment they put it in writing, Nathan told her, they've committed fraud on paper. Right now it's just a pattern nobody can prove. Once they approach you with documents, and you have someone ready to expose exactly what those documents actually do, they've handed you the weapon yourself. The offer came, as Nathan predicted, almost exactly on schedule. A representative from a firm calling itself Coastal Vine Partners arrived at Claire's vineyard on a bright, cold December morning, immaculately dressed, professionally warm, offering to clear her entire water rights debt and provide additional operating capital in exchange for a modest 20% equity stake in the vineyard. Claire, coached carefully by both Nathan and her attorney, played the role of a relieved, slightly overwhelmed young owner, grateful for the lifeline. She asked for time to review the paperwork, standard and unremarkable, and the representative, seeing no red flags in a young woman eager to save her family's land, agreed without hesitation. What the representative did not know was that within 6 hours, every clause in that contract had been photographed, analyzed, and cross-referenced against 2 other, nearly identical contracts her attorney had already obtained from vineyard owners in neighboring Mendocino and Lake counties. Owners who had signed similar deals 18 months earlier and had since lost majority control of land their families had worked for generations. What happened next was not the dramatic warehouse confrontation this story's audience might expect from a mafia tale. It happened in a county agricultural commission office in Santa Rosa, fluorescent lit and utterly unglamorous, where Claire's attorney, alongside 2 other vineyard owners who had come forward once they learned they weren't alone, presented 3 matching contracts, a pattern of predatory acquisition, and a paper trail leading back through 4 shell entities to a distribution company with a Chicago-based parent organization already under quiet federal investigation for unrelated matters. It wasn't enough, on its own, to bring down Vincent Caruso's operation entirely. Organizations like his rarely collapse from a single exposure. They simply retreat, restructure, and resurface somewhere else under a different name. The same way phylloxera, once introduced into a region's soil, can never be fully eradicated, but only managed through resistant rootstock and constant vigilance. But it was enough to permanently poison Sonoma and the surrounding counties as viable territory, enough to trigger a state agricultural fraud investigation that made every future acquisition attempt in the region radioactively risky, enough that Coastal Vine Partners quietly dissolved within 3 months, its remaining pending offers withdrawn without explanation. Nathan Caruso understood. From the moment he decided to warn Claire in the mist outside her barn that there would be a price for what he'd done. His father did not survive on sentiment, and men who compromised operations, even for reasons Vincent might have privately understood, did not simply get a stern talking to and a second chance. 2 weeks after Coastal Vine Partners dissolved, Nathan disappeared from the small rented house he'd been using in Santa Rosa. He didn't tell Claire where he was going, not because he didn't trust her, but because what she didn't know, she couldn't be forced to reveal. For 4 months, Claire heard nothing. She focused on the vineyard, on the water rights negotiation she eventually settled through entirely legitimate county channels once the fraud investigation drew unwanted attention to the water district's own irregular practices, on the small but growing recognition her Zinfandel received after a regional wine competition judge, unprompted, noted the same rounded, low-acid finish that had first caught Nathan's attention at the Barrel Room months earlier. Then, on a foggy morning in April, as the vines began pushing new green shoots through the last of the season's dormancy, a truck she didn't recognize pulled into the gravel drive. Nathan stepped out, thinner than she remembered, a fresh scar along his jaw that hadn't been there before, but unmistakably him. Claire set down the pruning shears she'd been using and walked toward him without a word, not sure whether to be relieved or afraid, not entirely certain which reaction made more sense. "I can't stay here," he said, before she could ask anything. "Not in Sonoma. Not under this name. What we did, it worked, but it also means there are people who'd very much like to have a conversation with me that I don't intend to survive." Claire felt something cold settle in her chest. "So this is goodbye." "No," Nathan said. He reached into his coat, not for a weapon, not for anything that belonged in the kind of story people expected when they heard the word mafia, but for a folded piece of paper, a deed transfer document, already signed, for 8 acres of undeveloped land in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, purchased under a name that had no connection to Caruso, no connection to Wren, no connection to anything that could be traced. Pinot Noir soil, he said. Cooler climate, longer ripening season, completely different profile than anything you're growing here. I've spent 4 months learning everything I could about it, because I needed something real to offer you, besides an apology. He looked at her, steady despite everything. "You're coming with me," he said. "Not because I'm telling you to, because I'm asking. New name, new place, a vineyard that's actually completely, legitimately ours, built from nothing instead of stolen from someone else. I know it's not simple, I know it's not safe, but it's honest, and it's the only thing I have left to offer you. Claire stood in the gravel drive of the land her grandfather had left her, 12 acres of Zinfandel and Petite Syrah, just beginning to wake from winter dormancy, sap rising invisibly through woody trunks that had survived phylloxera, drought, and now, quietly, an attempt at outright theft. She thought about her grandfather's hands, thick and scarred from 40 years of pruning. She thought about the water rights fight she'd finally won. She thought about the small, stubborn pride of watching her own wine, made from her own grandfather's vines, win recognition on its own merit. And she thought about Nathan, standing in the mist outside a barn 4 months earlier, choosing, for the first time in his adult life, to tell the truth instead of protect a lie. "I'm not leaving this vineyard," she said finally. "This is mine, my grandfather's. I fought too hard for it to walk away now." Nathan nodded slowly, something like resigned understanding crossing his face. "But," Claire continued, "there's no rule that says I can only have one." What became, over the following 3 years, of the 12 acres in Sonoma and the 8 acres in the Willamette Valley was, by any honest account, an unlikely success story built on 2 very different soils and 2 very different pasts. Claire split her time between both properties, learning firsthand the biological differences between Sonoma's warm, fog-moderated growing season, ideal for the thick-skinned, tannin-rich Zinfandel her grandfather had planted decades earlier, and Oregon's cooler, longer ripening period, better suited to the thin-skinned, temperature-sensitive Pinot Noir grape that demanded patience most vineyards in hotter regions could never offer. Nathan, living now under a name known only to Claire, her attorney, and a small handful of people who had helped arrange his exit from a world he'd been born into rather than chosen, learned viticulture the way he'd once learned everything else in his life, thoroughly, carefully, and with an attention to detail that made him, within 2 years, genuinely skilled at the work, rather than simply hiding behind it. Vincent Caruso's operation, weakened by the Sonoma exposure and a subsequent federal investigation that picked up threads Claire's case had first unraveled, never fully recovered its West Coast ambitions. Whether Nathan's father ever learned the full truth of what happened, or simply assumed his son had died quietly somewhere rather than accept the harder truth that he'd chosen differently, remained, deliberately and permanently, unknown. What Claire Whitfield knew, standing some 3 years later among rows of new Pinot Noir vines, just beginning their first meaningful harvest, was simpler than any of it. Sometimes the person who almost destroys everything you've built is also the person who teaches you exactly how much you're capable of protecting. And sometimes, against every reasonable expectation, an unplanned kiss on a rain-soaked sidewalk turns out to be not an ending, but the first honest thing either person involved had done in years.